Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the strategy session. I am Lisa Senecal, and I am here joined, as always, by Stuart Stevens, an expat from the Republican Party for a long time now, and who, as you all know, if you're regulars to this show, has been out there helping to lead the charge against Trump and Trumpism. And so, there's job security in that, apparently, unfortunately. And we are also really happy to be joined tonight by David Noll. David is the co-author of Vigilante Nation, How State-Sponsored Terror Threatens Our Democracy. His co-author is John Michaels. This is a really important book. We're so excited to have you here with us tonight, David.
Well, thanks so much, and great to be here.
Yeah, this is something that we've seen throughout history. So if we can just go back a little bit and frame for everybody, because for a lot of us, when we think of vigilantes, a lot of that comes out of movies, and sometimes they're even the mostly good guys like Batman. That's really not what we're talking about here.
Yeah, there is this tradition in movies of vigilantes as these individuals who operate totally independently of the state. And, maybe they're doing that because, the Gotham Police Department isn't doing its job. And so you need the masked crusader to step in and bring back law and order. And that's, academics talk about that. That's certainly one kind of vigilante. But in the book, we make the case that when you dive into US history, that kind of sort of lone wolf vigilante isn't the most concerning kind. And we also have this other tradition of vigilantism, of private actors, people who are nominally private, operating either in partnership with a political party, so it might be the Democratic Party during Jim Crow, or with the explicit backing of the state. And so they're sort of taking advantage of that public-private distinction. And it's typically to enforce reactionary cultural agendas. So, you can go all the way back to the fugitive slave laws and look at vigilante enforcement of those laws, where slavers could send their agents and bounty hunters into the North to recapture fugitives, bring it forward to Jim Crow, where private actors were absolutely essential to enforcing white supremacy. And in our book, the argument that we make is that on the far MAGA right, lawyers and lawmakers are reviving some of these legal tricks and reviving some of these legal tools to enforce a specific Christian nationalist agenda.
Stuart, you've obviously studied a lot about these sort of historical patterns, not just in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about, you touched on this in your book, Conspiracy to End America. Can you talk a little bit about this history, not just in the United States, but there is a long and ugly tradition of, in part what David was just describing, of reporting on your being informers on your neighbors and members of your family, even.
Yeah. I mean, goes with the essence of being in the Soviet Union, and East Germany being the greatest example, where they estimate like 1 out of every 3 people living in East Germany was a Stasi informant. David, let me ask you, when did you start working on this book? When did this idea really come together for you? And can you just kind of walk us through, I always find it interesting how you seize on an idea and then that sort of process, and then you end up on strategy session talking about it. But what was your of all the things in the world to write about?
Yeah.
Why and when, and some of that genesis. I find that fascinating.
So I'm a law professor, and my area of specialization is courts and procedure. So I've done a lot of writing about how the courts work and how litigation works. And we got into this back in 2021 when states like Texas were enacting these laws that used private plaintiffs to sort of wage the culture wars. So the most infamous example of this is Texas's SB 8, which offers a $10,000 bounty to anybody who brings a lawsuit against an abortion provider or anybody who aids or abets an abortion. And so we were talking to lawyers back in the spring of 2021. We got some calls about, how do we challenge these, right? How should we be thinking about litigation surrounding these laws? And my co-author, John Michaels, is an expert in privatization. And he wrote an earlier book called Constitutional Coup, looking at the extent to which the federal government has used contractors and privatized key functions, everything from military operations to sort of routine data gathering, and thinking through the constitutional implications of that. And so we started to see these laws, and legal scholars were thinking about them mostly because they seemed like a hack that allowed Texas at the time to do unconstitutional things. Because remember, this was before Dobbs had overruled Roe, and everyone said, "Oh, this is just about staying out of federal court. This is just about Texas giving the middle finger to what at the time was controlling Supreme Court precedent." But John and I had been talking, and of course, we were thinking a lot about the insurrection, and we had been looking at how Trump and his circle had cultivated a network of vigilantes and militias. And that all came out in the report of the January 6th committee. And our thought was that, no, this isn't really just about evading judicial review, right? This is about using law to cultivate these networks of vigilantes. And so we started diving into what the states were doing. And we can talk about it, but right, we found this whole mess of laws that states were putting in place that pretty obviously had the effect of empowering vigilantes and empowering them to enforce MAGA values.
The laws that have been passed, we were talking a little bit before we went live tonight about David Pepper's Laboratories of Autocracy book, and how this experimentation, exactly what you're describing, has been taking place in states all across the country for years now. What do you see now that we're about to usher in the second Trump administration, between all the experimentation that's been done, the much more sophisticated administration staff he's going to be bringing in with him, the amount of time that they've had to plan and write a 900 plus page manifesto outline of how they're going to implement this in Project 2025. And I assume Trump is going to follow through on his pledge to pardon the January 6th insurrectionists, who, at least the ones who have been brought on federal charges, which is most of them. Where do you see this going? How much more empowered do you think this vigilantism becomes when Trump is back in office and people see that there will not be serious long-term repercussions for a lot of these people who broke laws?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can start with the pardons. He's dangled pardons to the January 6th insurrectionists. I do believe he'll do that. The question that I have is how far-reaching they'll be. I think it'll be, one thing if there's some isolated pardons that are, designed to get on Newsmax to rally the base. I think it'll be something else if you start seeing mass pardons. And that takes us down a very dark path, Stuart, if you've been studying totalitarian countries and authoritarian countries and the road to that. When people ask what's going to happen during Trump 2.0, what I always say is keep an eye on the appointees. because Donald Trump doesn't do legislation, right? Donald Trump is not going to be Lyndon Johnson, cracking skulls in the Senate, ironing out compromises, getting tough bills passed. And so, to the extent legislation happens, it'll be generally, right, legislation dealing with the funding of the federal government. But look at who he puts in place in key federal agencies. And one appointee that people should really pay attention to is Russell Vought, who has been tapped to lead something called the Office of Management and Budget. Now, that is a really wonky, you would ordinarily learn about it in an administrative law class in law school. But OMB is the office within the White House that both works on the federal budget and handles relations with departments and agencies. So when you have something like Project 2025, and Vought was deeply involved in Project 2025. So when you have something like Project 2025, OMB is kind of that transmission belt where the White House is able to say, this is how we want you to exercise your power. And if you read the introduction to Project 2025, or if you dive into the specific policy proposals, there's all kinds of things that are drawing on these state experiments in vigilantism, setting up snitching regimes, like Stuart was talking about. They're obsessed with DEI, and so there's going to be all kinds of efforts to stamp out DEI throughout the federal workforce. There's sort of the J.D. Vance weird types who are obsessed with divorce and procreation, and thinking about how we can use federal power to put those policies in place. And that's going to happen, There's going to be a lot of sort of setting up federal supports for vigilantes that are drawing on these state experiments, happening below the level of legislation, happening through these policies that agencies are putting in place.
David, can I ask, I was watching an interview with you and John before the election. And I'd love to hear what your thoughts were, how the election was going to go, how it went, and because it certainly went in a different direction than I thought. But and do you think that the elections went smoothly? Mm-hmm. Anyway, just talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a pollster, and so I was relying on people who did this for a living, and everybody thought it was going to be a very close election. And the scenario that I was worrying about a lot was a surge of vigilante activity, either as people were voting or as the votes were being tabulated. Because, as everybody knows, sort of votes are tabulated at the local level, at county boards, and then reported up. And there was a real effort, and I think it would have happened if the election had been close.
Or gone the other way.
Yeah. Gone the other way, exactly, to put pressure on those local officials, either to throw out ballots or even just to delay the count, which can compromise the electoral college. Mm-hmm. And the reporting on that was pretty clear. There was, there were conspiracy theories that were traveling throughout right-wing media. People were believing them. So there was this whole thing about non-citizen voting, which miraculously didn't happen. And then sort of all of that was an effort to mobilize people to put pressure on these local boards to essentially pressure them to manipulate the results. So this is the one time you're going to hear me celebrate Trump's win. Trump's margin was large enough that we never really got into that close election scenario. That's not to say that he has a huge mandate, but it wasn't within the margin where vigilante attacks or a big after the fact litigation strategy can realistically push the result one way or the other. And so, paradoxically, I think this was a good election, right? There had been these massive investments in protecting the integrity of the vote. Counties were doing things that, in my view, sometimes went to the absurd, to be transparent and to show, this is how the ballot goes from the voting machine to the van to the counting center, in order to try and debunk some of these conspiracy theories. And so paradoxically, I think Trump's win had the effect of strengthening democracy. Of course, right, the but to that is that only happened because Trump won. And the uncontested, violence-free, vigilante-free election is something that you only see with a Republican victory. And so, as a nation, really, we have to get ourselves to a place where that happens whichever way elections come out, because in a normal, healthy democracy, parties trade power, and one party wins one time and another party wins another time, and we need to be there.
The psychology of all of this fascinates me, because you did have people primed that this was going to be a stolen election, that it was going to necessitate some degree of vigilantism to correct the stolen election, and then it wasn't, and magically, none of these things that apparently, the Democrats had spent the past several years putting all these plans in place to make sure that, enough undocumented people had been brought into the United States, and we were going to break all the voting machines, and we're going to be able to steal the election. Apparently that fell through in every state in the country.
I know, a massive failure by Vice President Harris,
right? We pulled it off so well in 2020, and somehow we blew it in every state in 2024. It's just amazing how that happens. But how do these people make that mental leap to, okay, clean election, thought this morning it was going to be dirty, but turns out it's all fine. But again, in the midterms, if it looks like the Democrats are going to pick up some seats, it will definitely be a dirty election again.
Well, I spent a lot of time listening to Steve Bannon's podcast and looking at Newsmax and stuff like that, writing the book. I confess that since the election, I have not been studying it with the same degree of attention that I did when we were reading the book. I think folks on the other side would say, we succeeded in securing the election. There were all these voter suppression bills that were put in place in 2021 that were explicitly enacted based on the big lie. There was a lot of attention on the election. And so, were I on the other side, I'd say, oh, look, this all paid off. The Patriots were there guarding the drop boxes, election officials knew that people were watching them. And so that's why we didn't run into this time.
David, let me ask you a question. I struggle with this. I think Trump is an autocrat. I think the Republican Party has become an extremist movement. I mean, I spent almost 30 years working for Republican candidates, so it's really heartbreaking to me. What do you think this question is the right attitude for respond to deal with people who support Trump completely, who do believe that the election was stolen, who do believe that laws that have, like in Texas, I mean, I have a lot of anger toward that, but there's sort of like, I think, a lot of different ways to look at it. What do you think is, in almost like a citizenship sense, how should we deal with that?
Yeah, I don't think anyone has figured out the answer to that question, because a lot of people are going to go home for Thanksgiving and have relatives or family members or friends over who believe in this stuff deeply. And we all know, if you want Thanksgiving to be a success, you don't talk about the election, or you don't talk about some of these conspiracy theories, because the level of belief in them and the sense to which they're sort of just baked into people's thinking, who are it's sort of beyond the Newsmax, Fox News level now. Now it's it's moved into all these right-wing social media networks, including tragically Twitter. Are pushing this stuff. And so it's, from a democracy democracy perspective, and as someone who teaches law and wants my students to go out and participate in our democracy, of course you want people to have those conversations. But what do you do when the response is there's a caravan that Vice President Harris is bringing to the country to engage in massive non-citizen voting? I mean, one thing that I'll say that my one contribution to the election prognostication discourse is that people know what they're signing up for when they get into the MAGA stuff. And that is owning the libs, making sure that all of these people who are challenging the people who traditionally have held power are put in their place, getting rid of this political correctness stuff, sealing the border, all that kind of stuff. And, just as an amateur election observer, because the Democratic Party contains so many groups, right? It's the party of constructive governance now. It ends up, resulting in a message which is a little bit something for everybody. So if you like civil rights, we're the party for you. If you like, the antitrust laws to be enforced, we're the party for you. And I understand how we got there as a communication strategy or as a way of getting people to really believe in democracy. I have my doubts about that. We're going to serve everybody, and we're going to be everything for every group that's interested in constructive governance. And I think there has to be, an articulation of what are really the values that are a response to MAGA. And for me, having done all the vigilante work, part of that is we're going to continue to make collective decisions. We're not going to let bullies dictate the agenda of our schools or our communities or whatever have you.
So what does that look like in practical terms, where we're not going to let the school boards be shouted down and bullied and book bans put in place and curriculum destroyed? We're going to stand up for our friends and neighbors and family members who are immigrants or even U.S. citizens who were born here but look like they could those people are going to get informed on too. So what does it look like for the citizenry to be pushing back on vigilantism?
Yeah. So in the book, we have 19 model laws that we urge blue states to think about adopting. If you want all 19, pick up a copy of the book and you can see which makes sense to you. But let me just start with some basic points about how we're thinking about this moment. One is that this is going to require solidarity because, although Trump narrowly won the election, there is a huge part of the United States that still believes in pluralism, that still believes in civil rights, that still believes in the rule of law. And we're the party out of power now. And so, what that means is, I always urge folks to get involved. Maybe that's your local party. Maybe it's your union. Maybe it's a pro-democracy group. But you should do that both for strategic reasons, because you're going to be able to exercise more power, but also just so that, you don't forget that, that we're not yet living in a country that has gone full MAGA, It's very closely divided. And I think it's important to people, for people to take care of themselves and to take care of their communities, and getting involved at the local level is something they can do. I'd also say, don't forget that law is going to be on our side. A lot of what is coming is either going to be totally lawless or supported by legal arguments where if you push on them a little bit, they quickly fall apart. And even if the courts aren't going to stop what's happening, I think it's important that people hold on to the idea that it's illegal and it's aberrational, because people believe in law, and it's got real persuasive power. It's got normative power. And then, a classic out of the literature on resisting authoritarianism and totalitarianism is don't comply in advance. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of that now, even from federal prosecutors and federal agencies who are, astonishingly saying, well, because Trump will be in office and because Trump will do the dirty work of corruptly pardoning people or even pardoning himself. We need to, right? I don't know, set the stage for him, which is just utterly bewildering to me.
Yeah. So David, how on a scale of 1 to 10 on the tragedy of not having these cases brought sooner against Trump, should this lay at the feet of Merrick Garland? I mean, was there a different scenario where these could have been brought sooner so that last year Jack Smith would have had Trump in a courtroom? And would that have been better? I mean, I assume so, but how much did this sort of, I mean, you can make a case this really damaged rule of law because people at the bottom of insurrection were punished, those at the top, including, the Republican Attorney General's Association, which was involved in it. Do you think that's fair? Is it unrealistic to expect that Garland to have done more sooner?
Well, Stuart, if I could get in a time machine and go back to 2021 and have a sit down with Merrick Garland, the one thing I would do is urge him to have a look at the literature on democratic decline and how countries lose democracy.
Right.
Because he came into office with the idea that the way to rebuild trust was to do everything by the book and, make sure that every T was crossed and every I was dotted so that nobody could level accusations of partisanship. And that was a fool's errand because he was operating in an environment where no matter what DOJ did, it would immediately be spun as a partisan attack, and no amount of good process was going to convince Newsmax viewers that these were legitimate prosecutions. But what you get out of that literature on democratic decline is that when there are coup attempts or when there are serious attacks on the democratic system, if the leaders are not punished, and by that people mean jailed or worse, then they repeat the attacks. And I think that urgency was just completely missing in the way that the federal cases were run. Now, you referred to tragedy, right? The fact that the documents case landed in front of Eileen Cannon, who abused her office to slow it at every step of the way, and ultimately throughout the case, really is a tragedy because that was a random judicial assignment. And I think that case, you just can't take classified documents and leave them in the bathroom of your country club. People make a big deal about, it's a complex statute and that you have to follow procedures to keep confidential information confidential. But come on, this is a story that the American people understand, and everybody knows that what he did was wrong and criminal, and it really is a tragedy that case is going to go away.
So we've been watching MAGA, Trump, all of his minions working outside of all the norms, and the Biden administration, the folks like Merrick Garland, trying to operate within the norms of how a democratic civil society functions. And we are where we are at this point. Do we need to be thinking about this completely differently and not be looking at the normal way that that we need to resist? We have to be asymmetric. If we're the only ones following the rules, you're going to lose the game.
Yeah, I don't know if I would call it asymmetric, because right now things are pretty asymmetric the other way, it seems to me. But it does, right? We make the argument in the book that there's a lot of untapped power, particularly at the state level, that blue states are just sitting on. So a simple example, right now is that these sort of extremist legislatures are trying to make it illegal to engage in interstate travel, either to get access to reproductive health care or gender affirming care, and that's largely a one-sided phenomenon. Blue states haven't enacted laws that penalize that. And they have the same power to enact laws that these red state legislatures do. And, as I think about it, if somebody is interfering with your ability to travel to Illinois or to New York or Connecticut and really infringing a constitutional right, your right to take a plane from Austin to New York, why do you get a free pass for that, right? Why isn't there civil liability? Why isn't there criminal liability for that kind of interference with the national marketplace? And so, we do argue that blue states do a little bit of hardball, just in the sense of using the powers that they have, because liberals and progressive tend to, we're stuck in the 60s and we have this idea that, one of these days Congress will get its act together and enact a new federal civil rights law that will save us all. But people forget that came after decades of struggle, including state policymaking. And you have to do the work in your cities. You have to do the work in your states to lay a foundation for those kinds of big federal interventions.
So, David, how would just educate us on how that would work? Say you have state A, which has made it illegal to travel into a state to have reproductive health care. Mm-hmm. And state B is a state which supports reproductive rights. Mm-hmm. How would state B use those rights you're talking about? How would that work? Because they can't stop another state from prosecuting someone from doing it, or can they? You tell me.
Yeah, you're getting into what lawyers call conflicts of law or choice of law, and it raises a question about how far state regulation reaches. And so, to summarize an entire law school class, the simple answer is you need some connection to the state that's exercising authority. So if you're gonna enact an SB8 law that imposes penalties for interfering with the right of interstate travel, New York can't do that for a Texan with no contacts with New York. But the fact of the matter is we have tons of interstate contacts all the time, right? This show is traveling through, many different states. And so finding one of those jurisdictional hooks is a lot easier than people tend to think. And particularly, when if you have somebody who is specifically, if you have one of these abortion vigilantes that's specifically trying to keep somebody from reaching to New York, legally, that's not that problematic, right? There's ways to write that law in a way to reach, say, a Texan or a Floridian, even though they're not physically located in New York.
That's really fascinating. We have to have a whole separate conversation about really focusing in on the legal tactics that can happen, because I think a lot of Americans are feeling right now like there are a lot of Trump judges, and eventually you end up at a very conservative, borderline, completely Trumpish Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. And I think we have a tendency to forget all of the legal avenues that exist to us still, that we have to be more nimble.
That's right. And, I think one thing blue states can take from red states is that part of what you're doing is setting the agenda. And so, Texas enacts a lot of stuff that is unconstitutional. And, some of it gets struck down. But by doing that, it creates opportunities for the Supreme Court to move to the right. And, I think blue states should be thinking about the same question from the other side, right? What can we be doing, both to protect our residents, to protect people who are trying to get to our states, but also, to think about, how those laws are going to change the law. And, there are opportunities there, despite the rightward lurch of the Supreme Court.
Well, David, I wish we had more time to talk about this. This is really fascinating. Everyone should get your book, read it more than once. Vigilante Nation, it's
really tremendous book.
It's tremendous, and it's something that we're going to all need to continue to refer back to over and over again for the next 4 years and probably beyond that, because we have a hell of a lot of work to do to get us where we need to be. Not that we were ever there, but to even regain where we were. So thank you so much, David, for joining us, and hope we'll have a chance to talk with you again.
Thanks
David,
to both of you.
How do we follow you? Are you engaging in the evil practices of social media at all these days?
Yeah, like somebody who believes in democracy, I have left Twitter for Blue Sky. So just type David Noll into Blue Sky and you'll find me pretty quickly.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for taking the time.
Thanks to both of you.
Well, I every time I either watch one of these shows or participate in one of the shows with you, I always feel like I have like 75 more things on my to-do list and things that I need to process and remember. But that felt really valuable to me.
Yeah.
So in addition to Blue Sky, everybody please check out SezUs, SEZ.us. Another social media option that it just has a fascinating way of operating, and I hope people will look into it, because it's a chance to have your voice have more impact based on telling the truth and having civil discourse, and not just trying to find ways to be able to tear people down. So check that out, SezUs. And make sure you come back here every Tuesday evening for the strategy session. On Wednesdays, Maya May has her new show that isn't so new any longer, and it's just wonderful. Tomorrow night, we have one of our most favorite people, Jen Murcia, is going to be joining Maya. That will be, it'll be a brilliant conversation. It will also be funny, and I promise you it is going to be inspirational. So I hope you'll join. And the week after that, she has Jason Stanley following it on for the next show. And also another person, you need to read everything that Jason Stanley writes. The Enemies List podcast, the Lincoln Project podcast, Decoding Fox News. Please check all of those out. Support Resolute Square, and read everything we're publishing on the website. There's so much work to do, everybody, and we are really thrilled to be in the fight with you.
Thanks for joining.
And happy